What's up, ladies and gentlemen of YouTube? Boogie2988 coming at you live once again through the power of the internet. And this is a rambling video, completely unedited. I'm not going to put any graphics up or anything like that. Put it on while you're playing a video game. Listen to me in the background. I think it's probably going to be 15 or 20 minutes long. But in the last year, we have seen Betty White die, yes, but two great comedians, Norm Macdonald and Bob Saget. And both of these guys had very unique senses of humor. Norm had a very solid, absurdist sense of humor that I really enjoyed. Not that offensive, sometimes offensive. Bob Saget's sense of humor was two-pronged. But I want to tell you a little bit of history about myself before I get into Bob Saget and Norm Macdonald here. Just know that I'm here to defend Bob Saget. I think he's a good dude, and I'm going to explain why. When I was a kid, I was already pretty fat, and I used to look at entertainment because fat people when I was a kid was so rare. It was so hard to find fat people. I know these days you see like 1 out of every 100 people is like a big fat fatty. But back then, it was me and like 3 other Americans. That was it. And we were all invisible. We all hid in our homes for the most part. But occasionally when you turn on the television, you would see an actor, a stand-up comedy person, or a professional wrestler who would be morbidly obese, like I was already by the time I was like 12. And I thought to myself, well, maybe that's something I could do. Because I don't know if I can do these other jobs. I barely fit in clothes. I barely fit in seats. I barely be able to stand on my feet for very long. So probably I need to be one of these things. Well, I looked in professional wrestling. It was never going to happen. I do not have the discipline, the physical attributes. Though when it came to stand-up comedy and acting, I thought that's something I could do. I know I'm not very funny, but I studied stand-up comedy because I thought it's something I could get into. I watched a lot of family-friendly comedy on a show called Evening at the Improv. If you ever want to, all of those Evening at the Improv sets are on YouTube and getting uploaded every single day. You can watch those if you want to by the official Improv channel. So you can watch the comedy that I was watching in the late 80s, early 90s as much as you want. And there I saw really great comedians, including Bob Saget, Norm Macdonald, Amazing Jonathan, John Panette, another fat guy. And I loved it. I love this family-friendly style of comedy. But I also branched out from there, moving on to HBO. And HBO had unfiltered comedy. The likes of George Carlin, Richard Pryor, Eddie Murphy, really, really offensive comedians. Like Andrew Dice Clay, whose entire bit was he was a 1970s greaser who hated women, right? That was his shtick. He made a lot of really offensive jokes about women. And it turns out that Bob Saget loved to tell dirty, horribly offensive, inappropriate jokes too. And it's kind of weird that was the case because he was like America's Dad, who's on Full House, and he was on America's Funniest Home Videos, coming into your house every Sunday night with a wholesome family show on ABC, the family-friendly channel. And a stand-up comedy that I saw on Evening of the Improv, while a little bit edgy, was nowhere near what I was prepared for when he reinvented himself in the early 2000s. If you have never heard of a movie called The Aristocrats, and you've never specifically heard Bob Saget's telling of The Aristocrats, you should hear it. The Aristocrats is a joke that comedians tell other comedians to make them laugh. So it's a very simple setup and premise, and then you improv, make it up as you go, and generally it's told different ways, but in general, most comedians tell it as the most offensive ways as humanly possible. And the way that Bob Saget told that joke is one of the most disgusting things I've ever heard in my life, and I laughed my ass off. As an adult, as a 47-year-old man, I've outgrown that sense of humor. The Sam Kinnisons, Richard Pryors, Eddie Murphys. I've gone back to watch Eddie Murphy's Raw, and I cringed all the way through it. I couldn't imagine why I ever thought that was funny. Sam Kinison, still very shocking, but sometimes thought-provoking. Eddie Murphy, not that thought-provoking in Raw. And most of what Bob Saget told as jokes, I don't find funny anymore. Though if you follow me on Twitter, you'll know that when Bob died, it moved me pretty specifically because I've been listening to his podcast a lot lately. I got into podcasting in the last year during the whole COVID thing, and I've enjoyed his podcast. And the character that Bob plays on his podcast is very much the Bob that I think he genuinely was. I think he was a genuinely very good person. And I know this because whenever he would bring a comedian onto the show, obviously all of these comedians after his death said, "Oh, Bob was so sweet. He was such a good person. He's so kind. Loved him to death. When I came to Hollywood, he did this for me, did that for me." But they also said that on his podcast to his face, but they also said it before this man passed in times that they didn't have to. And yes, sure, some of the people that he had on his podcast, Bill Burr, offensive comedians, that kind of thing, but also comedians that just are kind and sweet and PC and loving and good people. And there's not a bad story about Bob Saget that I've heard. The only thing you can hear that's bad about Bob Saget is that his comedy was offensive. And it was. I'm disgusted by it. So offensive that I don't even find it funny. I guess I'm getting older and getting more conservative as I get older when it comes to that kind of thing. But even 20-year-old me would have shook my head at some of the things that Bob has said in his reinvention. That said, there are people online right now trying to say that because Bob Saget made these horrible and offensive and terrible jokes, that he was a horrible, offensive, and terrible person. And I don't think that to be the case. The most recent episode, might be the last episode of Bob's podcast, is with B.J. Novak, who's from The Office. He played Ryan on The Office, helped write, produce, direct, and acted in The Office. So, incredible talent. You might have seen him in Inglourious Bastards and other great shows. But in that episode, B.J. Novak talks about how when he came to Hollywood to write for Bob's show, he got taken under his wing, and whereas Bob was a partier and he liked to goof off, he was actually a really kind-hearted, golden-hearted, good person and treated everyone around him with love and kindness and respect, even though he loved to make offensive jokes. And specifically, the joke that Bob is getting a lot of slack for from a handful of people on YouTube was him joking about the Olsen twins, him making offensive jokes on the set of Full House, which is obviously a family-friendly atmosphere. And here's the thing. I'm not defending those jokes. I don't like them. I don't find them funny anymore. Different time when he was making those jokes in the late 80s, early 90s, those kinds of jokes were much more popular, much more okay, much more fine. And I don't think having an offensive sense of humor and saying offensive things for the purposes of comedy makes you a bad person or makes you an offensive person or a disgusting person. I genuinely don't. And I think Bob is the perfect example of that. Getting a little off track, but what I want to say with this video is that I think it's tasteless to attack Bob after his death. And I do genuinely think he was a good person, regardless of his terrible sense of humor, which I think was a product of our time, my time. 65-year-old man probably shouldn't be making the types of jokes that he was making. I didn't find him particularly funny or interesting anymore, but I did like the person that he was. And I did like the stories that he had to tell. And I did like the person that he had become later in life. And I think losing him the same way losing Norm was a fucking tragedy. That style of comedy and the comedians who made those types of jokes are dying out. But what's so interesting is that even those comedians don't make those types of jokes anymore. Bob was doing stand-up, and it was raunchy and offensive from time to time, but nowhere near as disgusting as it used to be. And I'll tell you why. A lot of people are going to point the finger and say, woke culture, woke culture, woke culture. It's because of the progressives, because of the leftists, because of that. But that's not really it. That's not really it. Yes, those people will attack you. Those people will get you canceled. Those people will get your jobs taken away. That does exist. That's a thing that's happened. It's happened to me. I get it. I understand it. 110%. The real problem is idiots. The real problem is idiots, really. The kind of people that might listen to your comedy, that might listen to your YouTube videos, that might listen to shows, the parents that are being dissuaded by misinformation on Facebook, the types of people that believe everything they see on Reddit and Twitter and everywhere else, are the same types of people that might show up at your comedy show, watch your comedy, and hear you have a joke about the Olsen twins, something along that lines, and say, I feel that way too. You're confirming my beliefs now, and I'm going to use it as an excuse to go be a piece of shit. That's the real danger. I think that's the real danger these days. Obviously, the people who say Bob Saget's a piece of shit because he made pieces of shit jokes and reinforced terrible ideas. But it's mostly the people that say, ha ha, yeah, he's racist like me. He's a sexist like me. He's offensive like me. I like being this person. I don't get the joke. I don't get that this is offensive and that's why it's funny. I get positive reinforcement from it. It's funny for me because I agree with this outlandish, purposely blown out of proportion joke. That's the basis of comedy. That is the basis of comedy, is taking a scenario and ramping it up until it's outlandishly funny. Doesn't matter if it's physical comedy, stand-up comedy, shock comedy, doesn't matter. The entire point of comedy is to make a premise that's so unbelievable it makes you laugh. If you're telling racist jokes because you believe they're true, they're not jokes, you're just talking. The joke has to be that you're not racist. The joke has to be that you're not a piece of shit. That's what the comedians on stage are doing. But people don't get that. Two groups of people don't get it. The people who want to use that to reinforce their negative, awful behaviors, and the people who want to cancel you for daring run the risk. That who might believe in secret you might be the person, but also that you might be reinforcing those negative behaviors. That's why media has changed so much. That's why social media has changed the internet so much, comedy so much, and other things. The period of time where you can safely get on stage and make an awful joke, which it's not something I want to watch anymore. It's not something I want to participate in anymore. It's not something I want to support anymore. It's not something I will do in my personal or private life anymore, ever again. It's not something I'm comfortable doing. But the time for that to exist is gone because people have gotten so fucking stupid. And Bob is one of the last people to dare to push the envelope. I mean, you still got your Bill Burrs and people like that until Bill screws up and gets canceled, I guess. But Bob is one of the very few people to prove that you can be a good, kind, sweet-hearted person and treat everyone in your life with love and respect and kindness and hoist them up and lift them up and use your platform to bring them up into the world and give comedians and actors and directors and writers a chance, but also make horrible jokes while you do it. He's one of the last people to prove that, and his loss, right when he was getting back into doing stand-up comedy, right as he was getting back into the world, right as his podcast was taking off, 160 some episodes of his podcast, incredible. You should listen to it. Listen to the BJ Novak episode. He talks about dying way more than he should, and it's the last episode that got released before he passed. It's a pretty big tragedy, not just because he was funny, because that was true for Betty White. That was true for Norm. Hilarious, thought-provoking people. But because Bob was just one of the good ones. And let me leave you with this. Somebody pointed this out on Twitter. I probably should have led with this earlier in the video, but you know, Bob made a lot of offensive jokes, but behind the scenes, he was a really good person. Bill Cosby never made an offensive joke once on stage. Turns out he was a real piece of work. So those are my thoughts for the day. I don't know if you're into these types of things. I don't know if you'll enjoy this type of video. Let me know if you do. It's just some things I wanted to get off my chest, things I wanted to get out into the world. Guys, as always, thanks for watching. I love you very much. I will speak with you again soon. The world's a little less funny with Bob in it. Probably a hell of a lot less nice.